Guns, guns, guns. We are pointing forward, and we are clicking. But in no flat-screen game could you ever see a player take the magazine out of their weapon and by their own will balance it on the tip of the barrel of the gun like this. Such logical freedom that we get with VR was clearly seen by many years ago, and we started to put together the tools for what is a very logical progression in gaming, is it not? In interactions. So we could do things like this. After reloading, we have nowhere to put the magazine. We don't want to put it on the floor. Rest it on the gun. Just these simple little bits of freedom that when our brains put two and two together, one thing leads to another. And it was exciting, wasn't it? It was exciting seeing the logical extension of gaming take its next logical evolution, its next logical step. The freedom we had that presented themselves to us, the options that presented themselves to us. And then we stopped. We just stopped. We decided instead that we're going to take a few steps back. We decided that we're going to regress, and we're going to make VR a medium that is not a logical, progressive step from flat-screen gaming, but instead one that is going to cater to an audience that doesn't know any better. And eventually, when that audience grows up, they will expect things like this. A world that you logically can interact with even when you don't need to. But you know how the rules are. You know that this being an object in the world, things will collide with it. Your gun doesn't fall through. The bullets. As you expect. VR is the freedom of knowing that if I take this object here and brush it across these others, they will react in an expected manner accordingly. This is VR in its most logical, basic form, where our brain's neurons start firing and realizing that we can do this. We have this level of freedom now, this precision. And one thing should lead to another. But it didn't lead to another. The market simply wasn't there, it seems. Beautiful, isn't it? The joy, the freedom of knowing that I can treat the magazine as a magazine and not a situational object attached only to the weapon and serves no other function. It is its own object in the world. Nor does this weapon have to be in my hand for it to register that this magazine goes within the object. All of these logical things that were being thought of back in 2016 when this game released. And yet here we are, 8 years later, and this kind of thinking, this kind of freedom has all but been abandoned. Here's a question for everyone. How much would you be willing to pay for a very good VR game, single player, 10 to 12 hours story-driven campaign? And here's a counter question for you. What makes a good VR game? What makes a good VR game, everyone? I'm now expecting to receive 10 to 15 contradictory answers. Because until we can start agreeing collectively from devs and players alike what makes a good and satisfying VR game, then we're not going to get very far, are we? A hybrid between Alex graphics and story, and Boneworks player-controller interactions, full physics system. But what any good is the physics system if the game design is not made for the player to properly and meaningfully utilize it, which is, I would say, one of the key issues with the Bone series. You have all the fancy physics, very, very, very little to do with them, meaningfully. It introduced all of these fancy physics things and possibilities which could be done, but then it gave you a bunch of guns. What are you going to do with that? Even if the guns were removed, the conflict, the enemy AI, was so basic that you couldn't really utilize the physics to any meaningful effect beyond pushing them around a bit. It shot itself in its own foot, metaphorically. So a commenter says, my standard is that the mechanics should be reasonably immersive and physical. You hate that stuff in a game devs do where they rely too much on menus and buttons that disconnect me from the world. Okay, you're onto something, but then where we drop the ball with communicating this, and where I think devs don't really agree or at least understand your mindset here, when you say that mechanics should be reasonably immersive and physical, why? Why should they be? Why does that suit VR? What is it about VR that has you demand those particular things? Mechanics that are reasonably immersive and physical. Why? This is the depth of communication that I think players have failed to convey to devs, and devs have failed to realize themselves, or at least value. I think that we have to set the mechanics before. There's no point in making these big games if playing them feels janky and poo. You're onto it. You're getting down to the core issue of the matter. You think it's because being more immersed and doing what I do in real life just amplifies and multiplies the whole experience. If I throw a grenade through a menu and it doesn't hit the same as using talk. Right, okay, yep. It amplifies and multiplies the whole experience by having things be physical and more immersive. Yeah, okay. But why do you have that expectation for VR? Why? Players don't seem to know how to communicate this. They just feel that something's off or good, but they don't know why. And I don't think that devs really have cottoned on to this either. There's a lot going on in the subconscious, our expectations, that we are not grasping. And today's devs, at least in the VR market, don't seem to have the intelligence or the insight or the wisdom to be able to perceive this themselves. Very much of it is subconscious, but so few of us are able to actually communicate these things into meaningful, compelling expressions that we can translate into useful information. He says, every day my desire grows just to say F it and make a game that actually uses VR interactivity. You can make a game that uses VR interactivity, but why would someone care about that? Just because I can flip this gun on this options panel, why would anyone care about that? Why would anyone see that on a flat screen and think, I want to give it a go? It's not just about the interactivity. It's about tapping into the psychology, the core psychology of what makes movement compelling and interesting to us. So before you think about the interactivity, think about the psychology behind what makes the most basic level of interactivity interesting for us as humans. You need to be a bit of a psychologist in this regard here, because it seems that many other devs are failing to do this. Think about what we find fun within the core action of moving our limbs. Go back to basics and build from there. And you don't need to make anything too complex. Look at Beat Saber. Look at I Am Cat. Look at Gorilla Tag. Wildly successful games. What do they do with the interactivity? In terms of actual mechanical complexity, not very much, but those games understand and capitalize on very core, ingrained basic psychology of what makes movement worthwhile and enjoyable for us. Because as much as people will complain on internet forums especially that they don't like to move, they have no idea what they're talking about. They can't think beyond the inch of their nose, because given the right context, the right motivation, humans are more than happy and stimulated to move. Guys, I think I know the secret to VR. Maybe you can work it out before I tell you. I think I found the secret. But I've actually been showing you the secret to VR this entire time. I'm doing it as we speak. Before I tell you the secret of VR, or what I believe to be the secret of VR, I'm going to play you a little clip from Matthew Matosis, the beautiful, gorgeous, highly intelligent, insightful, considerate Matthew Matosis, who is by far the best YouTube game analyzer critic that has been around. Intellect far beyond me and probably beyond you. No idea if he's good looking, but I'm just going to assume he is. Either way, he makes some interesting videos. Bear with me. Here is a quick clip from Matthew Matosis's Mario 64 review, which he did many years ago.
The core mechanics are very well thought out and have a great feel to them, with a certain sense of momentum to them. This can be credited to a decision made by Shigeru Miyamoto early on in the game's development. Rather than jumping in head first and creating levels and other mechanics for Mario to interact with, Miyamoto focused on Mario himself. The rabbit, which can be found in the basement of the final version, was one of the first things to be created, and early on the team simply placed Mario and the rabbit onto simplistic maps and chased him around. Apparently, Miyamoto continued for a long time to play in a simplistic garden level, trying to make the simple act of moving Mario and chasing the rabbit to be a fun and engaging experience. Now, I'm not one to give people a free pass simply because of their reputation. I think Miyamoto, like any human being, has made some good and bad decisions in his time, but his attitude to Mario 64's development is nothing short of genius. Making the transition to 3D brings so much uncertainty that there would have been no point in making Mario 64 at all if they couldn't first and foremost make sure it would feel good to play. This focus on getting Mario himself right above all else paid off in spades.
Okay. This is what we need to do for VR. This is where I think VR has gone very, very, very wrong. This is where I believe that we need the attitude of Miyamoto applied to VR. We understand that VR is, for all intents and purposes, another significant leap going from flat screen in terms of the interactivity and what is possible. But I feel, whilst we understood this in the initial impression of VR, we quickly have lost sense of this. What needs to be done is to take things back to their utmost basics and make the simple act of picking things up and engaging with the motion controllers a fun, stable, and consistent experience before anything else, and go from there. I think this is the attitude which VR needs. Take it all the way back to the drawing board. Go back to basics. What is the thing the player is doing the most with the motion controllers? Well, they're moving them around, and they're usually picking things up, gripping things, moving things. So the simple and basic act of doing that should be responsive and reliable and make sense and be integrated in a way that is enjoyable to do first and foremost before anything else. But how many VR games all the way up to the very present day do we still have such anxiety, uncertainty, and inconsistency on whether we're going to grab the object that we place our hand over, let alone be able to throw it in a direction that makes sense according to our intentions. We still haven't even got the simple act of being able to accurately pick up an object correct, let alone be able to toss things and throw them around, that we can trust what the results would be. So we need to go back to basics. We need that attitude. We need the attitude of Miyamoto. We need that back. Thank you very much, Matthew. I love you. You're amazing. What VR really needs to nail before anything else, it's this. See what I'm doing here? This is really, really, really fun. Don't believe me? In your real-world environment surrounding you right now, grab a ball, grab a bottle of water or something that has a bit more momentum in the physics that might flip around a bit. Throw it up in the air and catch it. Pay attention to what your brain is doing when you flip up and catch that object. It is such an almost mundane and easy action. Pay attention to your brain just as you catch it. There is a little burst of reward that you get there. a little burst of satisfaction. Because when you do such a simple action, you have to account for whether you are moving and the velocity and the strength and the timing that you need to apply on that first initial flip that predicts the future, that will enable you to then successfully know how that object is going to behave and rotate and how fast it's going to go, for you to be able to successfully catch it by the time that you have placed your hand, or wherever you're going, in the position that you predict it's going to go. And you can do this reliably in quite complex ways over and over and over again. This is the core basic fun that we enjoy as humans and have enjoyed for thousands of years, that VR can exploit, thanks to the introduction of motion controllers enabling that fine precision movement. There is an enormous amount of prediction and precision that I have to employ in order to flip this and successfully use the correct amount of strength and speed that the gun will flip only once and then land in roughly the same area again and again. And because the game's physics have been implemented in a realistic enough way that reliably simulates the results of what would likely happen in real life, this in itself is a fun and engaging experience in a very, very, very core and basic primitive way that we have enjoyed for thousands of years. Guys, we have made literal sports that we dedicate our lives over, make teams and tribes over, spend millions and millions, if not billions and billions of our real-world currency doing all kinds of stuff. We have built cultures around the act of bouncing a ball. Think about that. Bouncing a ball. Think about the action of bouncing a ball. It's absolutely no different to this. It's the same core motivation and behavior, and yet we find it so stimulating, so engaging, that we have built cultures around it, dedicated our lives to it. We find it so interesting and engaging on such a core level that we will do this. VR, with its motion controls, can now begin to capitalize on this kind of freedom with the physics systems we already have. If we can really nail these kinds of results as the absolute basic and then begin to build from there, that is the secret to VR. But we have taken things too far, too fast. We are overcomplicating. We are running before we can walk. We need to go back to basics. We need to nail these interactions and then gradually build on them. Would you like proof of what I'm talking about? Once again, Beat Saber, Gorilla Tag, I Am Cat. What are those games? Some of the most successful games in VR. What are they capitalizing on? The exact same core motivations and premise that drives us to derive great joy from the mere act of throwing or bouncing an object. And then applying modifiers to that, timed slices to the beat of that music, and they have seen great joy. Think about how basic it is. That's the secret of VR, in my opinion. We need to go back and nail this. Once we can reliably, predictably nail the movement and get it absolutely solid to make the act of just doing this, which I presently am, enjoyable in and of itself, go from there. I'm having fun doing this. This is amazing. This is amazing that we can do this in VR. We got to capitalize on it. This is where it begins. Go for 2 flips. Take 3. And that is just beautiful. That is freedom. That is what is amazing on a fundamental level in VR and these physics system. We have an engine here that enables the physics, and I can, just like in real life, use my instincts to perform an action like this and get the result which I expect, which is beyond anything that flat screen could ever hope to achieve with its inputs. And that is where it should all begin, and where the joy will emerge from more and more, but we have to take a step back and do this first. We have to get this right first and foremost. And that's when the truly unique experiences will begin to emerge. And that's what will cause us to begin to start playing VR in very different ways to flat screen and draw more people over, because it will offer them a dimension of interaction that flat screen could never hope to give them. And I want to say thank you to Anton for creating this context for me to sit in and talk to all of you and demonstrate this in real time. So thank you very much, Anton. It means a lot to us random strangers through the world. Thank you. Mr. V, what do you think would be a compelling core mechanic for a whole VR game? It's really hard to say, because one thing leads to another, doesn't it? It's the same with drawing a random picture, right? You start off drawing a few random things, and those random things inspire other things, and those other things lead to other things, and then it begins to create a whole big picture. And that's why I'm emphasizing now that we need to go back to basics and really nail these core motion controller interactions, that the act of picking up something and using the motion controllers should be fun and engaging. And then I believe that experiences centered around other more complex things will emerge from that. Juggling is a good mechanic, just disguise the underlying framework with a different metaphor. That's it, Tommy. That's it. That is exactly it. You aspiring VR devs think that you need to make this overly complex scene of a game in order to hope for it to sell? No, you don't. No, you don't. You just need to identify what is really enjoyable on a really basic level for VR that's not being capitalized too much on, such as juggling. Put that into a more creative context, but keep the basic core mechanic. Throw that together in a few months. One thing will lead to another. You'll earn money, I think, personally. And what's even better is that something this simple can be released on Quest, where there's more of an audience alongside PC VR. And just as Tommy says, you can make a game based upon juggling because the core action of picking up something and catching it is fun for us. Look at Walkabout Mini Golf. That's another great one. You're using a stick to hit a tiny ball. Look how popular that game is. You can do it, guys. You can do it. Just take it back to basics. Stay within your means, too. Don't get too ambitious. Remember what is fun to us. Put what I'm doing now into a different context, add some twists to it, but keep the core skill set, make it fun, make it a bit goofy, but present it well with style, creativity, and respect. You're onto something. FFS, Mr. V, I don't have time for YouTube and game dev now, I have to choose. My friend, I know your feeling. All these things I'm sharing with you now, I mentioned a long time ago that I've been tempted to dabble myself, but the reality is I can't afford it. You have to make a choice. I wouldn't be able to focus on the game side of things and do YouTube at the same time. So you've got to make a sacrifice. If any of you are in a position where you have savings or where you have the time and you don't have the overhead responsibilities to maybe put these things into action, then use that. I presently can't. I cannot reasonably justify taking such a risk, so I share my perspectives and insights, and I hope that some of you can, instead, put it into action. Just do well. Just do well. Oh, it's so satisfying. The way that just hung off the edge there, and I could flip it back on and save it, that's just so satisfying. It's so good. It's wonderful that I can do this in VR. It's so liberating. We don't need to overcomplicate it. We don't need to overthink it. This is the secret. That's all it is.